but I'm going to get started. Welcome to our Ask Me Anything event about climate change in Greeley. This is sponsored by Cooler, which is a National Science Foundation funded initiative aimed at developing a learning ecosystem in northern Colorado to strengthen climate resilience. I'm Kennedy DeChant, and I'm a student and active member of an environmental club on campus called Earth Guardians. It's a chapter at UNCO. And with us today, we have Dr. Cindy Shellito. Dr. Shellito is a climate scientist at the University of Northern Colorado. Dr. Shellito, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Yeah,
I'm excited to talk to y'all.
Oh, yeah, me too. I'm excited to hear your responses. At this event, we want audience members to ask any questions that you have about climate change, and especially if you have any interest in how it impacts Greeley, Colorado. And Dr. Shellito will do her best to answer. She's amazing. So, and yeah, we hope to help all of you and others learn more about climate change, and especially as it relates to Northern Colorado. So, no one has posted anything yet, so I'm going to ask you one that we've previously collected. So, should we be worried about the rate at which the climate is changing, and is there anything we can do to change this?
So I'll start by answering that question, by answering the first part of that question, or about the rate at which climate is changing. So when we talk about climate change, we're referring to the global average temperature. We look at temperature all around the planet. And what we find is that temperature has risen somewhere around over 1 degree Celsius, or about 1.5, 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit over the past 140 years. In fact, I think it's gone a bit above that now. And so and that may not sound like very much, but we're talking about the global average. So there are some places where the temperature has only risen by a couple of degrees Fahrenheit, but other places where we see large rises in temperature as much as 6 degrees or more Fahrenheit over the past 140 years, especially in the polar latitudes. We see warming that's happening very rapidly. Now, this increase in temperature over 140 years is unlike anything we've seen in the history of human civilization. So there has always been climate change, and we have always responded to climate change. But what's happening now is happening very rapidly. In Earth's deep past, there have been very large changes in Earth's climate over long periods of time. And most of what we see there in Earth's past is caused by natural mechanisms for changing climate, such as changes in the solar energy and changes in Earth's orbit. Those kinds of things act on much slower timescales. But what's happening right now is happening very fast. And it's because we are pulling carbon out of the earth to fuel our lives. Pretty much everything in our lives that's fueled by fossil fuels. We are burning carbon for that energy, and that carbon is going to the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide is really good at keeping some of Earth's energy in the atmosphere. So the question was also, could we slow it down? And right now, the one way to slow it down is to reduce the amount of carbon that we're emitting to the atmosphere. So that is our key, our goal, is to reduce the amount of carbon that's going into the atmosphere. That's the only way we're going to slow this down. And even if we were to stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere today, we would still have warming happening over the next several decades into the next century.
Yes, I guess I did not start off on a very lighthearted foot, but that is a really great answer. And yeah, really good for all of us to know, honestly. I think it's an important question. Next question going off of that. Let's see. These are questions your class asked you, like, in advance. So all made by students. When was climate change first noted or documented?
Ooh, that's a good one. Back in the 1800s, there was some work looking at or there were people were starting to notice that they would see changes happening in the winter, and they associated that with deforestation in North America. So I think that we first noticed things happening, or people first noticed things happening back in the 1800s. And that's also when people started noticing the connection between carbon dioxide and how that works to absorb energy in Earth's atmosphere. So we've known, for a good 150 or 170 years that changing the composition of our atmosphere can actually impact our temperature, atmospheric temperature. So it goes back about that far.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And my live chat was being a little funky, so I couldn't see some of your comments, but we have one from Penny. What are some of the things that Cooler is working on right now, and how did the organization begin?
All right, a little bit about Cooler. So Cooler is funded by this National Science Foundation grant Kennedy mentioned earlier on. And basically our goal is to find ways to connect UNC students and faculty with community groups and organizations on projects that build local climate change resilience. So when we talk about resilience, that's our ability to make a comeback, or to build back after suffering from the impacts of climate change, or to find ways to mitigate those impacts on our lives. So we want to help community members find ways to mitigate those impacts that we might be experiencing from climate change. And some examples in northern Colorado include, for example, increasing heat in the summertime. So we have a lot more days now that are above 100 degrees in the summer. What impact that has impacts on agriculture. There are changes in the frequency of severe storms. More hailstorms impact agriculture. Changes in our needs for heating and cooling. All of those kinds of things we want to better understand, and we want to find ways to help prepare students at UNC for going out into the world and working with people on climate change. And it doesn't matter what people are majoring in or what they're studying, because everybody needs to understand what's happening, and everybody's going to play a role in finding ways to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So even if you're an art major or a music major, you play a role in communicating what's happening and helping people understand what's happening and dealing with their emotions and that kind of thing. So there's a role for everybody in addressing climate change.
Yeah, and it's super fun to be a student worker for it, so love it. Okay, one from Sydney. What are some strategies individuals and communities can adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change in Greeley and similar environments?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I touched on it just a little bit a moment ago in terms of, finding ways to adjust. Our growing season is changing, so we need to find ways to adjust how we're planting, and we want to find ways to conserve water, especially here in northern Colorado. Precipitation fluctuates a lot more when we have a warmer world. So we may get periods when we get a lot of precipitation all at once, and then nothing for a long time. And we need to be prepared for that. So that means finding ways to conserve water in our neighborhoods, making sure that we're growing yards and planting things that will tolerate long periods of drought. Finding ways to change our growing season has shifted, so we need to find ways to adapt to that. So that might mean allowing, the fact is actually our growing season has now extended through September, so we can now grow things into September that we couldn't do that before, but also responding to things like increased frequency of hailstorms. That's going to be really important. For example, due to more fires in the mountains, it's another thing we'll need to figure out how to respond to.
Definitely. Yeah. We have a student in the chat, also Matthew. He says he doesn't know if you remember him, but he loved all your classes.
I remember you, Matthew. Great to see you. Thanks for coming.
Yeah. And then another question from Lindsay. First question from Lindsay. Is there variation in climate change or its impacts across Colorado? And then is there something that makes northern Colorado different from other areas in Colorado?
That's a super good question. I know Lindsay studies climate too, so she may already have some ideas here. But I know that we are here in Greeley, we are on the plains. And so there's a couple of things that are different than some of the other areas of Colorado that are more mountainous, for example. So in the mountains, we are going to be thinking about changes in snowpack because that's going to have strong local impacts, not just on our water supply, but also tourism because people like to ski. So we're trying to figure out, even if the amount of snowfall or rainfall that we get doesn't change, the length of time that snowfall is on the ground or how much precipitation falls as snow may change. And that is going to have a big impact on Colorado's economy overall. So that's something that's concerning in the mountains. Here in northeastern Colorado specifically, I think our biggest concerns here are drought and frequency of severe weather events. Those kinds of things are going to have an impact on our economy, our agriculture, how we live our lives, and what kinds of things we want to grow in our yards and that kind of thing.
Definitely. Okay, thank you. All right, another one from your students previously, that they made previously. What is the difference between climate change and global warming?
That's a good one. Okay.
Yeah.
So when I think of climate change, we could think of that as going in either direction, cooling or warming. I'm a paleoclimate scientist, so I've studied 4.6 billion years of Earth's history and all of the changes that have happened to our climate during that time, at least the ones that we can see or interpret or make hypotheses about in our geologic record. And we know that the Earth can get warmer and can get colder. So global warming refers specifically to the increase in global average surface temperature. And that's what's happening right now. So global warming is climate change. But climate change is not necessarily global warming. That said, we've started using the expression climate change. I think that's used more commonly now than global warming. And when we're talking about climate change in the present climate, it's referring very specifically to the warming that we see in the long-term record, the record over the last 140 years or so. So that's specifically what we mean by global warming. We're not trying to confuse anybody. I sometimes have people ask questions or they get frustrated because they say, well, you used to call it global warming and now you call it climate change. Are you trying to soften the impact? No, we're just trying not to, I think global warming is kind of a hot button topic and people get worried right away. Climate change, we aren't really trying to soften it, but it is climate change. But I think, global warming sometimes has kind of turned people off. It's not really incorrect. It's not misleading. I see another question there from Sydney, so I'm answering that. But it's not incorrect. It's just not used. Sometimes it immediately turns people off from the discussion because climate change can be very controversial to talk about. And climate change, global warming is again really a hot button issue, but it's not incorrect.